Welcome to the Consummate Athlete Podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going well. We're excited to be here again with another interview.
Yes, it's a little hectic around Consummate Athlete HQ right now. I'm not going to lie, but I am super excited about this episode. We have lawyer Ian Brisbin of velolaw.ca back on the podcast, and we are talking about all things basically bike law, which, is kind of a grim topic, to be totally honest, but I think it is such a necessary one if you're someone who's riding outside a lot, who is on the roads. It's just really important to know both what your rights are, but also, kind of your best practices for what to do if you are, whether you're involved in an incident with a driver or the cops or pretty much any other kind of, person to person situation.
Rebel, the cops,
the cops.
You mean the police?
I do get into that a little bit with Ian. I'm
right.
like my background as a punk kid makes this a really
Super
awkward
Catholic,
conversation.
Police hating. Okay. And I mean, there's also the whole issues around, which I'm not sure if you got into them or not, but around sort of stop signs and rolling stops.
Talk about that, yeah.
What are the laws and the different things that are governing our cycling?
Well, we're certainly in a tricky situation as cyclists because we both want drivers to follow all of the rules of the road, but then where do we fall on the Iowa stop? Do you roll through the stop sign? Do you stop at every stoplight? So there's definitely a bit of nuance there. And I think it's really a fascinating conversation and honestly, just such an important one to have and continue to have. And we talk about what, advocacy looks like in this space and kind of all of these different things. And the other thing we do talk about is we have these great little PDF ID cards, basically, that Ian helped us come up with that have sort of, here's the information that you should have on hand. You can print it out, stick it in your saddlebag. So that way, if you do, God forbid, get in any kind of accident, you kind of have that, because a big part of the issue that he sees is that people are kind of in shock when something happens and you're not necessarily going to respond or think of all of the things you need to do. So this card has sort of the steps you should be taking, as well as, here's all of your critical information that you can have to share around. So I think it's a really, really important thing to have on hand, because we're not all thinking, at 100% when something happens.
Sure. And those are things that often, your insurance company will give you those for your car, but
exactly.
Then, you might not have that on the bike.
Yeah. So this is just a really neat little quick printable. So you can find that over on the show notes. Those are at consummateathlete.com, or just pull up the show notes wherever you're listening to this or watching this. If you're on YouTube, hi, we're back. Very exciting. All right. With that said, let's get into this episode with Ian Brisbin. Enjoy. All right, Consummate Athlete, back with Ian Brisbin of velolaw.ca. Ian, how is it going? It's been a minute.
It has been a minute. I can never figure out if a hot minute is a short minute or a long minute, but it's been a minute. So it's you know what? I've adopted that everything that truly matters is good.
Perfect. That's what we like to hear. Exactly.
All right. I'm delighted to be back, though.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you back, because last time, we got through a few questions all about the law and bikes, but I feel like we definitely needed a part 2. So now we're finally back with that. For the people who didn't hear part 1, though, let's just have the quick refresh: who you are, how you got into both the cycling and the law. Give us the 30-second elevator pitch on how all of this has coalesced.
I got into cycling the same way a lot of us did, which is it was my first taste of freedom as a kid. And then probably like an awful lot of people, got away from it in the course of my, young adulthood, I suppose. I owe a very long-standing friend who needs to remain nameless because he's become very important in the interim, who introduced me to mountain biking when we were in law school together. And that was really when everything sort of started for me, and I haven't really looked back. It's become an important part of who I am, honestly. And the ability to be able to dovetail that with my legal practice is, I always say I relish the opportunity to put myself out of business. I'd rather that these things weren't needed at all. But if they have to be, I've got I've got all sorts of experience, from everything from being struck by a driver to all the legal stuff. So that's essentially it.
Love it. And okay, I want to hone in on what you just said, which is the struck by a driver. And I know I didn't have this on the list of questions, but it's funny. I was literally just writing a piece for Bicycling Today, a news piece, and it actually had the headline of Jumbo Visma rider in car accident. And when I saw that headline this morning, I was like, oh my gosh, like, why are all of the cycling publications saying in a car accident? Like, what is wrong with them? Like, don't they know better? And then I clicked on it and I was like, oh my God, he actually was in a car accident. He was driving a car.
Okay.
That
Okay.
one makes
Yeah.
sense. That one's okay. But why does the terminology matter? Like, talk to me through the struck by a driver, accident versus crash. I think that's just such an important point to get across first.
It's really not very complicated. Accident implicitly suggests inevitability. I mean, how long have we heard, accidents will happen, and nobody's perfect, which of course nobody's perfect is true. So essentially what we do is we say, because people are imperfect, we need to create the conditions that take that imperfection and at the very least render it to not be fatal or lead to serious injury. So that's a big piece of it, is just sort of getting people away from the idea that accidents are just kind of happen, and they're not really anybody's fault. But it's not a matter of fault. It's a matter of just making sure that people understand that cyclists are people, and that we want the same thing that every driver wants, which is to get home, and that we're entitled to that. So, and that's also true when we talk about hit by a car, a car accident, that sort of thing. It's passive language, and we all know how I was going to say the power of passive language, but of course it's the exact opposite. And the example that I always like to use is, it's trigger warning, but if someone's stabbed, we don't say stabbed with a knife. They're stabbed by an assailant. They're stabbed by a person. It's a person's action, inaction, mistake, whatever the case may be. So I think the point is to essentially emphasize to people that we all have agency. We're all making choices when we drive, and we need to be alive to the responsibility that goes along with that.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, as you were just saying that, I kept thinking about the fact that self-driving cars are becoming more of a thing. So there is actually, like, the language becomes even more important, because in a couple of years, there could be a genuine difference between struck by a car and struck by a driver.
Yeah.
Because they're like, now you have self-driving cars and they actually are the thing that did the thing.
Well, the irony, I mean,
wild.
I of course, as a lawyer, I say language matters. Of course it does. So it's all about our ability to communicate clearly and effectively, and to make sure that we're getting the message across that we want people to hear. So that self-driving car thing, that's a whole other issue, because of course they're very good at spotting cars. They're not so good at spotting cyclists and pedestrians.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we've got more than a couple of years for before that sort of thing gets rolled out on a significant basis. But as the status quo goes, we are, as 'twas ever thus, we're at the mercy of people. Mm-hmm. And at this point, the key importance is to focus people's attention upon us, and our attention on people.
Yes, exactly. So that leads into the first question I really wanted to ask you, which is just like, give me the too long didn't read version of, like, what rights cyclists have on the road. Because I know I tend to kind of approach road riding these days as, honestly, very fearfully, because I genuinely am concerned that somehow, like, drivers, like, seem to less and less feel as though cyclists are human and actually have the same rights as them. Might just be my perception, might just be me getting older and like realizing that I'm mortal. I don't know.
You're exposing your experience there in two ways with that question. First of all, you've obviously interviewed me before, so you know with the too long didn't read, you're saying, Ian, for the love of God, tighten this up. But the other point is the fact that I rather suspect you do know that there is data that says exactly that, that says that drivers see cyclists as less than human. And quite frankly, it's an ugly thing to say, and it's something that I find often gets really strong reactions when I say it. But the fact is that that we're seen as less than human, and that lives on bikes are just not as important as lives in cars.
Yeah. No, it's amazing just, sitting around the dinner table talking to friends about even riding up in Collingwood, where we are like a very bike friendly community. The number of stories you hear about drivers that are, they're going up a hill where there's like it's a blind top, and they're, honking at riders that are, not in the way, but they just can't easily pass them because there could be a car coming over the top that would also hit that. Like, it's mind-boggling how
well in a place like Collingwood. That's a great example. The other example that always comes to mind for me is Tucson, which is in a lot of ways is a cyclist paradise, in terms of climbing, in terms of flats, in terms of separated infrastructure now with the loop. But that is a city where you see bikes all the time, whether training, whether riding, whether running errands. Everybody's a cyclist. It doesn't matter if you're returning cans to the beer store. If you're on a bike, you're a cyclist. But the thing is that even with all of those bikes down there and so much infrastructure, a lot of it being paint, but also some separated, it's been a while since I've been there, but every time I'm there, I'm always really struck by just how many cyclist fatalities there are there. And I acknowledge it's a numbers game, I suppose, but at the same time, man, you really can't, as a driver, say I wasn't expecting to see a bike.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so as cyclists, we have the right to, not get murdered by drivers. That should be pretty understood.
Yeah, that's a good foundation for us to build from. Yes.
Yeah. But of course, like, flip side, I do think it is important as cyclists to acknowledge, like, we do have to also be, smart about how we are approaching riding. If we are, in this, like, we're riding a lot of hours a week, like, we're putting ourselves in these vulnerable positions. And, I will caveat this with, like, obviously, if you're riding on the road, it is not your fault if you get struck by a car. Like, that just should not be happening, but we can, protect ourselves and make sure we're like giving ourselves the best chance of making it home.
My cynicism creeps out right at the beginning, when you talk about having the right not to be murdered, because I do honestly believe, not legal advice, that cyclists, people on bikes, whatever nomenclature you'd like to use, if you wanted to murder somebody, wait till they're on a bike. I honestly believe that. And it's that's not a joke, because the fact is, the presumption is going to be accidents happen.
And the second one is going to be, were they wearing a helmet?
Exactly. Were they wearing a helmet when they were hit by an armored truck or something? Or a driver of an armored truck, of course. But honestly, this is one of those topics that I'm always a little bit hesitant to dip into too far, and that's because there are a lot of cycling advocates out there who I respect a ton. Okay, there's a lot of people doing a lot of good work. There are cyclists and cycling advocates who say, I have a right to wear headphones. I have a right not to wear a helmet. I have a right to wear dark colors. And all of those things are true. They just are. I take and I understand why that can be a big point to concede, because you're trying to avoid victim blaming, of course, and exactly the phenomenon that you just said, was he wearing a helmet, or was he wearing a helmet? And I honestly look at it and I say that I should not have to be a martyr for a cause, and no one should. And so my take is that there's something I've come to refer to as Rule 1. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the only rule that matters when you're on a bike. You can talk about Highway Traffic Act limitations and restrictions and so on and so on. But at the end of the day, there's only, like I said before, you've only got one job when you're out on a bike, and that's to get home. And that is to do whatever it takes to get home. And if that happens to break laws, if that happens to inconvenience people and draw honks or whatever the case may be, too bad. Because we have to look out for ourselves. We owe it to our families. We owe it to ourselves to take reasonable steps to protect ourselves. That doesn't mean that it's a legitimate argument to say, well, that adult cyclist that I hit with my car wasn't wearing a helmet. It would have been all different. That will not wash. Okay, that dog will not hunt. So, but me, my attitude, I've spoken to you about this before. I used to be one of those people who said, you know what, I want to look as good as I can. So I got the shoes that have got the accents that fit the kit that, match the bike. And then I had this nice white helmet with these nice blue accents, the Team Sky, blah, blah, blah. And then one day I said, why am I doing this? Because I don't want to look good. I want people to look at me and say, holy crap, what's that? Okay? So the color it's traffic cone orange. And that's exactly the point, is I want to do everything that will give all drivers every possible opportunity to see me, even if it's a matter of saying, oh my God, that's ugly. I don't happen to think it's ugly, but your mileage may vary. So yes, I believe in doing all of the things. You see people riding with, there's a young woman riding across Canada for to raise money for youth mental health initiatives, who is just going to be finishing up on Friday, I believe, doing Digby to Halifax in a day, which will be something. But she's got a pool noodle off the side of her bike. There's your 1 meter.
Mm-hmm. Which I love. I mean, I probably wouldn't do it, going out to do intervals, but you know what? If you're toting all of your stuff on your bike, like, you're damn right I'm putting a pool noodle on.
Yep. Rule 1. And it's also going to make a driver say, what is that? And maybe they'll look and maybe they'll say, oh, I had no idea. So, I mean, that said, these things happen not so much by accident, but for the most part, I really do believe that people are good. I believe that people do make mistakes, and that is the message that I have sort of turned when I'm doing public speaking and such to drivers is forget about the person on a bike. Okay, you're they're dead, their family's grieving, all that stuff. But you don't even need to go there. Even if you are so self-centered and so selfish as to say you don't need that kind of experience in your life. That is something that will forever change you. You might, until you've walked in those shoes, you cannot imagine what that weight is like. I see it when I'm examining drivers all the time. I've seen people who are just shells of people and have not driven since, have moved away, that sort of thing. So
I often think about that because, most people listening to this podcast do drive. So I think, sure, we're both we're talking as cyclists, but we're also drivers. So I think even listening to the show, this discussion here from the lens of a driver, I think is super important because what would you say? It's probably 99% of deaths that occur, from a driver to a cyclist are not intentional. Occasionally you hear about the road ragey ones. Those are the ones that get the most media play, but most of them are just distracted driving, just not paying attention. And I think about that often, I can't even fathom having that on your conscience for the rest of your life. So
There's
anytime
nothing,
I'm like even thinking about like touching the CarPlay when I'm driving, that's what I think about.
there's nothing a court can do to you that's worse than that. You know,
Exactly.
and so that to me is one of the things that we need to emphasize. And you know, ultimately your comment about drivers being cyclists and cyclists being drivers is absolutely true. There's no need for us to be defined by how it is we choose to get around. You know, some people don't like the term cyclist and say, well, a cyclist gives you the, you know, the mammal, you know, the middle-aged male in lycra image, and you know, it's the weekend warrior or whatever, and it is very white and very male. Um, Again, like I said before, to me, a cyclist is a cyclist is a cyclist. And so, you know, again, that's nomenclature, and people's opinions will vary, but ultimately we need to personalize this and to make people realize that, you know, and lots of good people have done marketing and tried to emphasize this, but it just doesn't stick. That's a person, that's a father, that's a sister, that's a coworker, that's all of those things. And the again, the definition of a person by how we choose to get around our cities makes no sense to me.
Yes, absolutely. I will apologize for the background noise. We've got some tile being sawed here.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah, right. Very exciting for us. But
Anything that moves the project forward.
exactly. But while we're talking about that, you know, I do think it is still smart for cyclists, if not for safety, even just for their own enjoyment of the ride, even just for like not dealing with, you know, aggressive cops. It's a wise decision to know what your rules in your area are. So can you just talk about like where people can find out, like where they can find what the heck their, you know, obligations are as cyclists in their area? Because so often you hear about people getting pulled over for riding two abreast, and they're like, well, I didn't know. That's not like, you know, we have speed limit signs on the road, but rarely do you have a sign that's like, no two abreast cyclists.
Yes. Yeah. I saw how gently you steered me back to the topic, and I appreciate that that heads up. So like that was very gentle yet firm. So thank you.
It's like I'm a professional.
It's almost like you do this for a living. Yeah. Yes, the lion's share, and by that I mean the vast majority of our rights and responsibilities, and to me those two words are dovetailed. I can't have one without the other, are summarized in the Highway Traffic Act, of course. And so that's where you'll find the vast majority of, you'll find things about mandatory equipment that need to be on bikes. You'll find, you know, obviously legislation of general application. You know, you can't blast through red lights, that sort of thing. The one thing you won't find is speeding for a bike. And that's because there isn't any. If you read the act, there are definitions between vehicles, motor vehicles, drivers, motorists, and all these terms mean something. So, you know, and that leads to the next issue, which is, okay, if it's not in the Highway Traffic Act, where is it? And that is something that almost invariably is going to fall in city bylaws. So, for example, we've all heard a great deal, and I remember speaking to you a couple of years ago about the infamous High Park issue. It might not be a popular take of mine, but the fact is, it's against a bylaw. It's against a bylaw that thou shalt not speed over 20 kilometers an hour on a bike, skateboard, you know, like make way for ducklings or other things with wheels in a park. And is that good policy? That people can differ on, but there's a mechanism to decide that. And to me, that is what I see my role in cycling advocacy is to be a voice and make those arguments in the right place. So when you're talking about the two abreast issue, that's one that's tricky because I've been in groups that have been pulled over. Police officers don't know. You know, they will cite the Highway Traffic Act, and you know, and some, you know, smart mouth lawyer will pipe up from the back saying, "Guess again." because you'll find it in bylaws, and that that gets tricky when you're talking about, for example, here in Halton, you've got two-tiered municipalities, you've got two different levels that are capable of legislating. So that said, most cities will have a link on their website to frequently cited bylaws. So that's where people who are having noise infractions or something like that would typically go to. Almost invariably, you'll find something about cycling in there. And if not, just run a search on bicycles, bicyclists, whatever combination and permutation, and you'll find out. Or, pick up the phone, call the bylaw folks.
Yeah, and this is such a great piece of advice for someone who's running like a group ride in an area. Like, it's so worth knowing that, because I can't imagine anything worse than being, a ride leader and having your group get pulled over and having no idea how to handle it.
Yes. And the traditional way to avoid that is that most everywhere that has a ban on two abreast cycling is there's an exception for passing. So that's where your rotating pace lines come into play. You may just be passing very slowly, but you're passing. So that's one way that really experienced cyclists deal with that. To me, the way that we all should deal with that is by advocating and by lobbying, because we all know that passing two cyclists abreast is safer than passing two cyclists nose to tail. I can understand why drivers would be a bit perhaps irritated by that, but again, drivers, rule one: we want to make sure that everyone gets home.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, there were 2 points you brought up in that answer that I want to click on. One is, you mentioned if you get stopped, sometimes there's the lawyer in the back that's going to raise his hand and say something. But
I've heard it happen.
What is assuming we're not lawyers, what is the smart way to deal with getting pulled over on the bike? Like, what are our actual obligations? How do we handle the situation? It's a tricky one, especially coming from this, very anarcho punk kid from my youth, where, the temptations, like to throw a beer bottle and like run away kind of thing. Like, that was my teen years. So
that's probably one that's best left in the past.
Yeah. To be clear, I never did that. I might have run or through an alley or something at some point in time. Not saying I did, pleading the fifth on that one, but
so it's like it's like the smart mouth lawyer. You may not be that person, but you've heard of it happening. That is often you're never going to go wrong with common sense. Now,
okay, but let's be clear, most people don't have that, especially when they've been doing an FTP test and suddenly they're pulled. Okay, or on any group ride where everyone is pinned and then suddenly you get pulled over and now everyone's there's a lot happening.
Or God forbid you're in the middle of an FTP test and you're killing it. So
officer, could you just 10 minutes up the road? I'll meet you there.
You're right. And that's where I was going to conclude with is unfortunately there's nothing less common than common sense. The pure and simple. That is you are not going to change minds. You're not going to change hearts and minds on the side of the road. The sooner you can get in and out of that conversation by saying as little as possible, the better. And if for some reason the ticket is flawed or there's something that the officer is mistaken about something, that's something to deal with in the cool light of day. Not like you say when emotions and your maximum heart rate is running high. Now, obviously, everybody knows that we are under no obligation to speak with police. There are exceptions to that. One of which is as a driver, you have to hand over your driver's license and proof of insurance and registration when it's requested by a peace officer. Cyclists, obviously, I would like to think, don't have driver's licenses unless they do. But we are not under obligation to show ID. We are under obligation to identify ourselves and tell the truth. Do not make up a fake name. Do not give a fake address. It happens all the time, and it doesn't end well. So essentially, cooperate. You know, it will bother. You know, like you say, your heart will sink, and you're just like, you know, oh, man, I'm given in to the authority of the state and all that sort of thing. But especially when we consider that not everyone's experience with the police is like mine, and so that interaction, the more cordial, the more innocent, and the shorter it can be, the better. And get home.
Yeah, back to rule number one.
Yeah.
And I mean, realistically, have you ever heard of someone fighting their way out of a ticket?
I've heard of someone talking their way out of a ticket, but I've heard of a lot more people talking their way into them.
Yeah, or into a
And
much higher one.
some people are better equipped to talk their way out of things than others. But you're right. It's we all think we're clever in that setting. We all think there's an explanation. If only they would listen. They won't.
Exactly. Like they
But
pulled you
temptation-
over. They
the
really want to give
temptation
you
is
that.
huge. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other point that you made there that I wanted to come to is the obligation to stop, you know, i.e. at traffic lights, at stop signs. And you just did a post about stop signs and the concept of actually stopping as a cyclist. I'd love you to just kind of explain where that came from, what your stance is. I know this is definitely like, I wouldn't actually say that many people will argue against you on this. They might go against what you're saying, but I think most people would agree with the spirit of it, we'll say.
And I will go against the spirit of what I'm saying too. Yeah, that post was one that I put up a little bit reluctantly, but the message that I discerned from it I thought was important enough. What it was I was out riding with a group of very strong riders who were on a ride that was a lot longer than mine, and I was actually just about to pop off and head home. And so essentially, what happened was a good friend of mine sent me a video, texted me a video that was waiting for me when I got home. And he mentioned that he saw us. He mentioned that he saw a large group of cyclists going through a stop sign at a four-way stop, and but that one person didn't, and that was me. And I don't say that in a way to big myself up in any way, but the thing that struck me about it was that he happened to be in the passenger seat, and his 16-year-old was out for a practice drive with him. And so he said essentially that this was a teaching moment for him. This was an opportunity to show that frankly the laws of or the rules of the road do apply to cyclists. And you know, there are times when people don't comply with them. Sometimes, like I've said, it's justified not complying with them. But at least at that time, the circumstance was such where I was just like, this is one that you stop at. And I did, and it's but whether it's that situation or anyone else, the fact is people are watching us. And we know that because we hear the stories about the scofflaws. You know, I saw cyclists once do X. Again, data. Drivers break the law more than cyclists do. That's a fact. Speeding, rolling through stop signs, those are the two major ones. But human factors, the way that we perceive information is that we look for outliers. And when we see 100 cars roll through a stop sign, just sort of do that California stop, we're not going to remember those 100 cars. We're going to remember the one cyclist who did it. And, you know, again, there are people out there who would say, Ian, you are imposing a higher standard on cyclists, and that's not appropriate. And I get that argument. I absolutely get it. But I also know that we're ambassadors for cycling when we do it. You know, I'm not sure that's right, right, but I do know it's correct. So we need to bear in mind that eyeballs are on us, and not just we need to be mindful of that, not just to avoid getting tickets, but I think more importantly to show that we do have the same rights to the road as everybody else, and that means by extension, almost invariably the same responsibilities.
Yeah, no, that's exactly, where I was hoping you would go with it. And I do think it is just like such an interesting concept to think of yourself as an ambassador for the sport, no matter what level you're at, no matter, whether you're riding a commuter bike to work or you're, riding in your team kit. Actually, to that end, like the team kit one is a very interesting one because like I will admit that I've personally sent a couple emails to team owners or like shop owners to be like, hey,
Yep.
if you're going to sell jerseys, you should probably make sure that like people understand some rules and like aren't being complete jerks. Cause I'm an interesting case, right? Because I run a lot. I see some pretty bad behavior on the part of cyclists a lot of the time. And it's,
I've probably done that a half dozen times too, and I haven't gotten a single response. Do I remember which shops those are? Do I remember which club? Darn right I do. I'm not going to name them, but they're ones you'd know.
Yeah. No, we often say like we get very nervous about the idea of, doing like we've done a couple jersey orders and we do them within, clients who we know and we trust are, generally good people. But I would get so nervous about just putting jerseys out into the wild because, yeah, you just don't really know how people are going to ride.
I'm not going to lie, that video, I was wearing kit with the name of my business on it, and did that factor into my thinking? Not knowingly, but be pretty foolish if it didn't.
Yeah, exactly. It would be very odd, yes, if it was someone wearing a jersey pointing out, legal stuff. Just
absolutely.
Actively just breaking laws left and right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but to your point about bad cyclists, there are bad cyclists.
Yeah, I mean, same as there are
bad
drivers,
pedestrians.
Oh yeah.
And so the best thing I think that we can do on the roads when we're riding is the same thing is the best thing we can do when we're driving, which is be predictable, communicate, make sure people know that I am turning here. You're not being aggressive, you're being assertive. Again, I know that there are a lot of people whose experience is not the same of mine. I'm more than comfortable taking the lane if it needs to happen. And I was just talking about a file this morning where someone's being blamed for not taking the lane that led to a tragic result. So it truly is a catch-22, but ultimately be predictable and communicate. And that's why the tinted window thing is the next dragon I want to slay, because the fact that it's almost impossible to make eye contact with people in certain cars, and that level of tint is legislated. That's a safety hazard, and as a result, I think we need to treat it as what it is, which is a public health issue.
I think that's so important. It's funny. I was actually just talking to someone at People for Bikes for an article about a month ago, and she mentioned the best way to keep yourself protected, especially when you're making a turn, is to be making eye contact. It's like the number one way that you can make sure that you're going to be able to make that turn without having an incident. So you're right.
I was a bad driver when I was young. I had collisions. But when I started riding, when I started running, I got good fast. And I started to realize that getting there that 30 seconds earlier just isn't worth it. And because you realize just how vulnerable you are. You can do it as a cyclist. We can do everything right, and it won't matter.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, the last topic I wanted to hit with you, of course, is like kind of a gnarly one, but we talked about mostly drivers being unintentionally crappy. Like we're assuming that most drivers are not out to hit you or intimidate you, but then there is a small category of ones that categorically are. And I think as cyclists, we come into a couple different groups. We have the group of like, I'm going to chase that car down that like buzzed us and like, blew smoke or whatever. You have like the ones that are going to like, I've been not ever in, thankfully, any kind of like physical like altercation, but I've been very close to being like on the sidelines of them a couple times. And thankfully they didn't escalate like the 1% higher that they needed to, but it's terrifying. I'm incredibly non-confrontational, so it's always like the most stressful thing in the entire universe. But say there's an aggressive driver situation and they don't just like speed off like into the sunset where you can't possibly catch them and you couldn't catch a license plate. Say, I don't know if they've stopped or they're going slow. How do we deal with super aggressive drivers? What is our best move, both like legally, but also like intelligently with rule number 1 in mind?
Exactly. This is a classic do as I say, not as I do, because I've never been in a fight in my life, because when you're a bit bigger, you don't usually have to back up those words, so that's kind of nice. But the thing is that again, you're not going to change any minds. It's no different than the person who's riding with say we're in a passenger seat with a friend and a driver does something to the driver of our vehicle, and we all know those people who are like, I'm going to teach them a lesson. No, you are not. You are not going to teach them anything. And it's again, not only are we mad when things like that happen, but we're also scared. It's terrifying. It's terrifying being hit. It's terrifying being buzzed. The example we always use is, if you want to know what it feels like, stand on that yellow strip at a train station and turn your back when a train's coming, because that's what it feels like as a continuous stream of traffic. But the thing is that, like I say, we're not going to change any minds. And if we are dealing with people who are within that, that outside one standard deviation, they're not going to be reasonable people. So reasoning with them is not going to work. They're playing to a crowd, or they're usually demonstrating their own insecurities or whatever. That's something for them to lie on a couch and talk to someone about. That's not something that I'm going to be able to educate them on the side of the road. If only my actions were consistent with that advice, I'd be far better off. But you know what? By mistake, I really do sort of want to touch on this point that's related to this, and I think it's a really, really important one. Is that, at least in my experience, anecdotally, I find that as a rule, drivers are far more courteous than they were even 10 years ago. I find their compliance with the 1 meter passing law is almost universal. I find that they're generally very respectful. They'll leave you space. They'll do all of those things. But the ones who are bad are worse.
Yes,
so
I will agree with that.
It's like everything else in society. It seems there are people who are courteous and there are people who are not, and those who choose not to be are they're just pushing it to the extreme margins. And so unfortunately we have ways that we think we can identify who these people are, but we really can't. And as always, when you're mouthing off to somebody who's done you wrong on the road, you don't know what you're dealing with. And I don't know if I mentioned rule 1 earlier, but that's a rule that I like to use. Yeah, and that comes into play here too.
Yeah, remembering that they have a several ton thing to back them up, and you've got your 18-pound carbon fiber thing, and you're in very slippery shoes.
And God knows what else they have.
Yeah, also that. Now, are you a fan of, like, if you can get the license plate, what's your thought on like actually like reporting them? Because I
report till the cows come home. I encourage that from everyone. When I was actually struck, I did everything wrong. Again, you're in the position where you again, it's different when you're there in the moment and the endorphins are going. But report everything. Report no data. If you report something without independent witnesses, and typically know the buddy that you're riding with doesn't count, then it's not like anybody's going to get ticketed. But a lot of police forces will send letters, and they will say you were observed driving dangerously, to at least send the message that people notice. Again, is that likely to affect the behavior of those types of people? Probably not. But data that is a weapon when we're going and we're making those sorts of advocacy presentations. We want to be able to present information that simply can't be argued with. And if it is argued with, sometimes we have to just say we're dealing with irrational people.
Mhm.
But all we can do is be our best.
Yeah. And I always kind of try to future think that if I have been in this situation where I have reported a, license plate number, and I always think of it as like that person's probably going to kill someone at some point.
Yeah.
And I really hope there's a record of, people that have called in and said like, hey, this guy is doing this, because I think that's probably going to help a lot in in that situation when that, tragic thing inevitably does happen because of that person.
Excellent point. A really excellent point. I do that with, if I see bad sidewalks or something like that. Yeah, I'll write the city. I'll write the city and I'll say this, this is terrible. Does it matter to me that day? No. Will that report possibly make a big difference to somebody in 3 months when it doesn't get any attention paid to it? Quite possibly. So, but again, this all reflects back on an overall theme, which is just, we got to learn to take care of each other. And,
Yeah.
and that applies to how we treat motorists. It applies to how we give way to pedestrians. It applies to how we ride on mixed use trails. All of those things. It may be naive, but I'm going to go to my reward without ever changing my tune on that. We need to be kinder, and we need to give one another a break.
Yes, could not agree more. And before we wrap up, last time you were on, we actually had like a really great ID card that we made after that people could download. So we're going to put that back in the show notes, because that's a really interesting little like PDF that you can print out, and it has sort of all of like the things that you want to know, the steps you want to follow if you are involved in any kind of accident. It's just kind of got that point by point things to remember, because in the moment, as we talked about, common sense out the window. You're a little shocky, your heart rate's high. It's really hard to think about, license plate, witness statements, pictures of your bike, pictures of you, any of that stuff in the moment. Just all whoosh, is gone.
Document everything. And the one thing that people always miss, if I have somebody answer in the affirmative to this question, it's a 1 in 100 thing. And it sounds like common sense. But if they all say, oh, there's this nice person who helped me. They made sure that I was, out of the way and got me a blanket and all that. Did you get their name? No. Never, because you're not thinking that way, right?
Right.
And if they are identified, it's because that person made a point of identifying themselves and saying, if you need me, here's how to get a hold of me. So yeah, it's and there are lots of different ways to get that information out there. That sheet is just another one. Lots of auto insurers give their insureds those. There are other lawyers who've been giving those sorts of things out for years. And is it marketing? Sure, it's marketing. But at the end of the day, if it helps somebody, it helps somebody. And
Exactly.
I just I am lucky in that I don't need to chase work, and that having been in this game for a while, I want to see less of it. I really do. I want to feed my kids. I want to put them through school, but I don't want to get those calls. And it happens with shocking regularity. And so I guess the thing is, people with jobs like mine, we're on the reaction side. We're on the something terrible has happened, now what? I want our cities and our elected officials to say, how do we keep these things from happening in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my gosh, Ian, this has been so informative, so instructive. I'm so glad we got to do this again. Let everyone know where they can find you, where they can kind of follow along. And I know on Instagram, you're always posting tons of great intel and hot takes, I'll say. So
Okay.
share all the things.
No, I got to say, Molly, you're such a good interviewer and so good at touching on those things. As you're answering questions, you can't help but bring out helpful stuff because you're you're such an informed questioner, and it's so nice when it's not a question and answer, it's a conversation. So I anytime I love this. First and foremost, it's it's fun, and I always
Agree.
appreciate it. Yeah, so Instagram, Facebook, as we've now started calling it, the social network formerly known as Twitter. It's practically become its name. The handle is at velolaw.ca, and that's universal across the board. The website is, I believe, velolaw.ca. It's just getting rebuilt. So I can't wait. I just got the web designer reaching out to me today, and I feel like you with your new bathroom. I'm just like,
I was going to say, you've got that going on digitally. I've got some physical renos happening. It's all happening for us.
I
Ian.
can't wait to see it. So, but in any event, if you go there is a link to be able to contact me. The socials is always good because I'm on there far more than I should be.
Oh my gosh, tell me about it. I actually just put some limits on my Instagram to get me to stop. So we'll see how that goes.
I hope it goes better for you than it has for me.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ian. This has been awesome, and you're welcome back anytime.
It's truly my pleasure. Thanks so much, Molly.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.